Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're back on the update 1.81 dev server, and what we find in front of us is the M1 IP. Now, some of you may be wondering what is the difference between the M1 Abrams that we have in game and the M1 IP, since they look incredibly similar and seem to have exactly the same characteristics. Well, this is the M1 Abrams, this is the M1 IP. They look very, very similar. Here is the side profile. M1 Abrams, M1 IP. So you can see there's a slightly longer bit at the back here on the IP, which is basically an area where the crew can store things, such as what seems to be extra fuel and some rugs. And with that said, some of the things that have changed are more internal than anything else. So one thing that we will look at is modifications. So these are all the modifications for the M1 IP. These are all the modifications for the M1 Abrams. As you can see, they're exactly the same. Everything is the same when it comes to ammunition. So with the ammunition that you're going to be dealing with on the M1 IP, if you're used to the Abrams' ammunition, well, you're in for a treat because it's exactly the same. The M735 is a stock round, 360mm of penetration is not too bad. Good muzzle velocity as well. And then the Hesh, and then the Heat FS, the Smoke Shell, and of course the M774. A lot of people were hoping for some DU rounds. Unfortunately, basically, not DU rounds, but upgraded rounds for any Abrams or M1s which were going to come in. Unfortunately, the IP does not get them, at least yet. What we get is exactly the same rounds, so get used to it. I think it's the best way of putting it. The major difference, or the only difference I can find which has any use in the battle, is the frontal turret armor. The M1 Abrams, if we have a look at it, this area here is 32-600-101 and then 32-600-101. The difference in the M1 IP, as you can already see, is that if we go here, 32-800-101, 32-800-101. So it gets 200 extra millimeters of external composite armor with nearer elements. This means that it has a better turret when it comes to being able to stop shells. 32mm 418 around the breech, which is exactly the same as the Abrams. Every other part of the armor is exactly the same. 32-300-101, 13-350-13. Then we have 13-350-13, 32-300-101. The front lower glacis, 32-600-101. Then on the IP, 32-600-101. So the literal only difference that I can find between the IP and the Abrams in-game right now is the extra 200mm of armor on the turret. If we look at the reload rate, it's exactly the same. The gun depression, exactly the same. The ammunition choices, exactly the same. The engine is exactly the same. The M1 IP is slightly slower. That's because it's about a ton heavier. And the reason why it's a ton heavier is, of course, because of this extra composite armor on the front. Without an upgraded engine, this basically means that it is going to be a little bit more sluggish than its M1 Abrams counterparts. But the main thing that you get out of the M1 IP is that you have another Abrams at 10-0. This means that the Americans now can form a 10-0 lineup, which has a good secondary vehicle in the form of another M1. So one of the issues that the Abrams had is that there was no vehicle that you could run with it which would be able to be as competitive as the Abrams at 10-0. You basically had the MBT-70, the XM1 if you bought it, or the M60 Rise. All vehicles which are very much substandard compared to stuff like the Leopard 2K, the T-64A, and so on. So with this addition, the M1 IP, you now have two MBTs at top tier, which I believe is the most of every nation, since if we look at the Germans, which are general competitors, you have the 2K and the 2A4 at 97-10-0, which is the closest comparison, and then you have the Soviets with the 9.7 and the 10.0, T-64B and the T-80B. So every major nation that is played at top tier now has two vehicles at top tier, which are MBTs. So now I believe the idea is that it's supposed to be balanced across the board. Of course, that isn't exactly the case, but, you know, at least it's better than before. The camouflages on this M1IP look beautiful, just like they do on the Abrams. So there's the basic desert, the late desert, late summer, always wonderful to see all the crazy colours, the forest camo, the winter camo, and of course the CA87 camo, which has to load, so I'll wait for that to load. It's actually huge. Why is it so big? You know what? We're going to order this. Screw it. I have 1,900,000 eagles. We're going to wait for it to load and see what it is. Really? It took that long to... It took that long to do that? Alright, whatever. Sure. Let's go with that. Anyway, let's take it into a test drive. So, as I said before, this thing, if you played the Abrams, you know how this is. There is really no foreseeable difference between this, apart from your turret is going to be able to maybe stop the Leopard 2A4 and Type 90 APF SDS. It has a probability of low to be able to pen it, and that is the rounds that I was talking about before. Let's just turn everything down so I don't blow your ears off. And with that said, the main thing that is going to be an issue for people like Leopards and Type 90s and so on is the fact that you won't be able to tell the difference between this Abrams and, the M1IP and the M1 Abrams. So, with that said, you're going to have to class everything as if you're fighting an M1IP. So this may give a kind of weird ninja buff to the M1 Abrams, because people won't shoot its turret cheeks anymore because they'll think they'll bounce. Instead, they'll just shoot all the other weak spots, such as the turret ring, which has no extra armor on it in this model, the driver's ports, and also the lower glacis, and or the gun breech. Basically, as long as you don't hit those cheeks, you're going to go straight through compared to everything else. So, with that said, the main advantage of this is that you get 2 top-tier MBTs now, making it equal to every other nation. If we actually look at the differences, when we look at the 2A4, the Type 90, and the Abrams, the only best thing that the Abrams did was its reverse. In the IP, it takes a little bit of time getting up to speed in reverse. As you can see, the acceleration with the extra weight on it backwards is definitely not the best, but every other factor is pretty much exactly the same. The actual model is slightly different on the front of it and on the back. As I said, the turret itself is slightly different, but overall it's very much the same machine. I think it's a good addition to the game, though. Obviously, the M1IP did exist, and what I think a lot of people will be sad about is the fact that there is no M1IP with the 120. The M1IP was the bridge, I suppose you could call it, between the M1 and the M1A1. And the M1IP, they had some of them fitted with the 120mm. This is still stuck with the 105, and I'm sure with the Abrams in tow, eventually there will be a 120mm version of the Abrams. This one is not that, though. This one is just the 105 with the same rounds, and so therefore the thing that people can complain about is that it doesn't have the upgraded rounds that everybody wants. Overall, though, I still think it's going to be a competitive tank. If we look at the meta right now, the meta is obviously very much what fits the Abrams. It's seen as a jack of all trades. Maybe the gun is not as good as you would hope, especially when facing stuff like 2A4s, T64s, and the new T80, and also the Type 90. But it's still good enough if you aim for weak spots, and the muzzle velocity and accuracy of the gun, which got buffed during update 1.79, means that it should be completely fine when we talk about top-tier battles. The Abrams right now on Thunderskill, even though it isn't the best way of looking at statistics, it is a way, it had a 50% win ratio, and that's exactly what you want. The issue was the Leopard 2A4 with above a 70% win rate. So with that said, will the addition of the M1IP change that? Will it mean that the Abrams, the Americans, will be able to challenge the Germans? And I think so, because it means that you'll get less XM1s in your game. It will mean that you'll get more... That's an interesting ricochet. It means that you'll get more Abrams in your game, so you'll be able to fight on equal terms with the other 10-0s. Overall, though, it is fun to have another one of the American Beauties in game. Hopefully in the future we get a 120 version, and I'm sure we will one day, but today is unfortunately not this day. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.